Hello and welcome. This is Becky LaPlante. I'm sitting in for Mary Magnuson today. And on behalf of the Blandin Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar about approaches for local governments to expand Internet access. This is one in a series of monthly webinars we're offering for our Blandin broadband communities and open to anyone with an interest in using technology to improve community. In a moment, I'm going to be handing over the reins to Bill Coleman of Community Technology Advisors, who will provide some introductory remarks and introduce today's presenter, who is Christopher Mitchell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. But before Bill introduces Chris, I'll point to the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. To interact with us at any time during today's webinar, you can simply type your question or comment in that chat box. I'm sure that many of you on today's webinar know Bill Coleman, but for those of you who don't, Bill has been with the Blandin Foundation's primary broadband program consultant for a number of years. And saying that, I'm going to go ahead, Bill, and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Becky. Today we're lucky to have Chris Mitchell with us as our presenter. Chris is really an expert on municipal networks and public sector involvement in broadband development. I know through my work that broadband networks and the competitive nature of broadband in communities doesn't really change much if you have one provider or two providers. Having a third provider in a community is really a market changer that brings a level of competitiveness into communities that really changes how the market acts. And over the years, we've seen a variety of both public and private sector entities participate as that third provider, and the communities have seen the benefits. So today we're lucky to have Chris talk about the public sector engagement. Chris is the director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Christopher's work focuses on telecommunications, helping communities ensure the networks upon which they depend are accountable to the community. He's a leading national expert on community broadband networks and speaks at conferences across the United States on the subject, occasionally to directly debate opponents of public ownership. So without further ado, I'm going to have Chris step up and introduce himself further and do his presentation. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone who is not watching Brazil kick off the World Cup right now. I have decided to wait as well, so I appreciate for everyone who's watching it in a side panel. I understand. It's a big deal. The presentation today, I want to start by giving a little bit of background, and one of the key things I think to look at one of the key lessons from today's situation in many communities is that you may pay 10 times, 100 times, and in some cases even more for similar access than a nearby community or other communities across the state. This is something that we don't see in other areas of infrastructure like gas, electricity, and water service typically. Usually those things are closer, and it's really not fair to expect one community to try and compete with other communities in terms of quality of life and business development opportunities and things like that if your access to essential infrastructure is so limited. So today, with that background of what we're facing right now in this great range of availability from community to community, I really wanted to focus on how some local governments have taken action, what they've done, and really I'm going to do an overview of a number of different options, and without having enough time to really go into them as deeply as I'd like, I'm going to focus on one particular aspect for a little bit, and then I'm going to open it to Q&A early, I hope, in about 30 minutes, so that we can talk more about the specifics of the different approaches and any questions people have, and I hope spend more time doing Q&A. But one of the things that I did want to make sure I noted when I started with is that I recognize that a number of people may be from communities for whom DSL would be an improvement, but we really have to be thinking in a longer term, and we need to recognize that even as some communities would love to have DSL, that DSL is rapidly turning into a technology which is the new dial-up. in particular when on the upload sides. And so as I'm talking about internet access, I am going to be talking generally about higher capacity kind of speeds and that sort of thing that would enable people to be very productive from home and that sort of thing. And I'm not going to be focusing so much on how to get a very basic DSL-like product out, because I think in many ways, even if your community does not have that yet, you're going to have to be trying to skip over that, because if you start working today to just try and get DSL tomorrow, it's already obsolete when you get it. So I don't want to, I don't want to leave anyone behind in this discussion, but I want to make sure it's pretty clear that we're going to be talking about the more next generation networks that are offering very high capacity connections and a much greater reliability. Now, if you're not familiar with our organization, we turned 40 this year. We're located here in Minneapolis with another office in Washington, D.C. We work overwhelmingly on local issues. We were founded in D.C. by two folks who happened to be in D.C. at the time, but we've never really been interested in federal issues except for trying to encourage the federal government to stay out of the way of innovative community projects. We work in a variety of areas, but about 9 years ago, we recognized that the internet was transitioning from a nicety to a necessity, as I like to say, which is to say that it was becoming really important for communities. And we realized that communities didn't have a whole lot of control. This is a space that's not very well regulated, and to the extent that it is, it's not by local communities, it's by the federal government, which isn't always aware of the best ways to regulate in the interest of local communities. So as we analyzed it, we came to the conclusion that if a community wanted to make sure that it had very fast, affordable internet access and reliable internet access, whether it was just concerned with those connections to businesses or connections to schools and libraries, or to everyone in the community, that there should be some sort of local entity that was accountable to the community that was owning it and operating it, because the owners are the ones that make decisions. Now, in some cases, a local private company may be filling that need, and that's a solution that across ILSR we're incredibly supportive of locally owned businesses and that sort of thing. We decided to focus on cooperative and municipal and nonprofit type business models, because our fear is over many years and over the decades, privately owned companies tend to be consolidated over time, and they turn into absentee owned companies. So not in all cases, but particularly when it comes to these sort of essential utilities that are so important for communities. So our work has really focused on these nonprofit business models. And within that, we've been most associated with municipal networks because, frankly, the co-ops have been doing a fine job. And we focused on an area of municipal networks where they were more embattled and it was more controversial. So with our limited resources, we wanted to focus within there. But you'll see throughout this presentation, I talk about co-ops as well, because I think that when we're talking about Greater Minnesota in particular, we really need to recognize the importance of that particular ownership structure. The key takeaway from today is going to be that a community has to have a plan. Local government, municipal government, townships working together, county governments really need to have a plan. That plan does not have to be to go out and bond and build a network that it would have to operate on its own. There's a lot of different plans. We'll cover some of them. And the end takeaway is just that you can't expect to sit there and ignore what's happening in this space and thrive. A lot of the greater Minnesota communities without internet access are struggling with growth, I know, where they're actually shrinking. My wife grew up up near Leech Lake, and it's hard to imagine someone wanting to return to a community that doesn't even have DSL after becoming accustomed to going to college and having very fast internet connections. It's hard to imagine the kind of businesses that will want to be locating in areas that have poor access to the internet. So it's in all of our interest to make sure that we figure out the best way of expanding internet access. And that's for local governments to recognize they have a role to play, even if that's just convening people who need internet access with an incumbent provider. And I think this is something that Blandon's covered extremely well, the idea of different kinds of plans that can be used. And we're going to be focusing in this presentation on the kinds of plans that have local governments taking a stronger role of getting together. Now, whenever we talk about local government starting to take action, there's a group of, there's an industry that funds think tanks and journalists and others to write articles saying that municipal governments don't know how to do anything. We've seen this for over 100 years. And in fact, I would argue that provisioning and building an electric grid 100 years ago was more complicated than building an internet network today. However, for over 100 years, we've seen local governments providing electricity for over 100 years at rates that are comparable and often lower than the private sector, and again, with at least comparable levels of reliability. So despite the fact that time and time again we're told that local governments can't accomplish anything, we find that they actually are quite good when they set their minds to these tasks. And an example of that is a recent study that came out from the General Accountability Office, a nonpartisan institution in DC that studied both municipal networks and networks that were funded by stimulus projects. And they found that these networks result in faster speeds, more reliability, lower prices, and increased investment for local businesses. So we've seen a number of different lines of evidence that all point to the fact that local governments do this and they can do it well. Now, I'm not going to be at all one to dispute that some local governments have made mistakes, and we can talk about those in the Q&A if people are curious, but I don't like to focus on them because we're tracking over 400 communities that have made some level of investment. The majority provide access just in a few areas of town or to a business district or something like that. But 150 of them are citywide. And of these over 400 local investments, there's a tremendous success rate. And the number that have gone catastrophically wrong is quite low. And even in the areas where they've gone quite wrong, there's still some remarkable upside. So I would say the worst case scenario is one that's not nearly as bad as in other areas where we've seen government make mistakes. One of the main reasons that local governments build networks is for jobs, to make sure that existing jobs thrive and other industries are wanting to come to town, but also for education. We see this throughout the country where schools don't have the access that they need right now. This report argues that the schools are going to need a gigabit to each location. That'll vary in some of the smaller schools, of course, but we need high capacity networks to schools, and right now that could break the budget of a number of schools. So this is an issue not just for connecting businesses, but also for our key anchor institutions. So I'm going to roll through some of the things that are already happening in Minnesota, and I'm going to come back and discuss WindhamNet in greater extent at the end. But they were among the first to build this fiber to the home type network back in 2004. Windham has been accused of many things over the years, and I'm going to try and disentangle that. But they're in the Southwest, and I think they've been a tremendous leader by example. The results have been good in terms of jobs. And then most importantly, I think, for the surrounding community is that Windham blazed a trail, a very small community that now has been able to connect 8 other surrounding small communities, and moving forward will again connect yet more. So if you're in an area, if you're in an area near one of these municipal networks, it can benefit you because over time they can expand that investment. On the other side of the state, or I guess more north, east of there, in the middle of the state, we have Monticello. Monticello is a more recent fiber to the home network, and Charter has really gone after them in a way that we have not seen other municipal networks suffer from. So Monticello is struggling currently. They have just recently changed management and will be reevaluating their approach to try and make sure that they're able to do the best that they can. But it's important to note that because the city of Monticello moved forward, they have some of the best internet access available in the entire upper Midwest. It's much less expensive, it's faster, and not only from the city-owned network, but also from the telephone company, which expanded its offerings to a fiber product as well after telling Monticello that under no circumstances would it even consider that sort of investment. It was very clear that TDS thought Monticello was doing just fine with its slow DSL product, but after the city built its network, TDS then built a fiber network as well. And that's the only place in North America that we've identified that has two rival fiber-to-the-home networks competing, each on their own network. And I've talked with international analysts that are among the most well-known and well-cited, and we don't actually know of another place on the planet, although I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least one or two other places. So to give you an idea, Monticello is really a rather unique environment, and they face some rather unique challenges. And I'm going to leave it at that unless people really want to talk about it, because frankly, I think a lot of the communities that are represented in here are probably going to be more interested in either more rural examples or examples where they're not going to be facing this kind of ridiculous opposition. And let me just qualify that by saying Charter took an offer that they offer in Rochester, Duluth, basically all of their markets in Minnesota. One of their top-end offers, $145 a month for all the television channels and their fastest internet capacity. And they began offering that for $60 per month at a guaranteed rate for 2 years. That's a package that probably costs Charter, we estimate, between $80 and $100 to provision. So for every customer who takes that, Charter is losing money month after month, and they're willing to do that to try and run Monticello out of business. And unfortunately, it's really hurt Monticello's numbers. They've missed their targets in the business plan, and they had to give bondholders a haircut. So the city's still wrestling with that and trying to figure out how to move forward. But those are the kind of challenges that you should be aware of. I think you'll hear more about the kind of the difficulties Monticello's had in coming months or in next year if we see municipal discussion again in the legislature, because the cable and telephone companies that oppose local governments taking action, they love to talk about the problems that Monticello's faced, although they're not going to talk about how it has far better internet access than any one of the rest of us has. Now, moving ahead a little bit, we have...
Christopher?
Yes. Yep.
There's a question from Daniel Hodem. Do you think we'll see the same thing with AT&T and Google Fiber in competition?
That's a good question. I think we will be seeing that because Google is committed to that. We haven't seen it yet. We've seen press releases that suggest we're going to get there. Now, I think it's interesting to note that anyone in Monticello has access to networks, whereas AT&T and I think to some extent others in the Austin market who are talking about fiber to the home, they're not talking about doing it universally. They're often talking about doing it to big apartment buildings and things like that. So it's not always clear in reading these press releases and what we're going to have. But no, Daniel is smart in asking that question because I think Monticello will not be the only place that has those rival networks, because Google has the might to go in and challenge in ways that small operators typically don't. So yeah, feel free to ask other questions as we go through. So I'm going to be going a little bit more quickly through some of these other ones. Those are the Monticello and Windham are important because they're the ones that are going to come up time and again. But the stimulus, the broadband stimulus from the federal government, resulted in 2 fiber-to-the-home networks in Minnesota, both in county-wide networks in the upper northeast region above Lake Superior. The one from Arrowhead, the electric co-op, built a network in Cook County, and that came out of a lot of effort from people within the county and people that lived in the region working together with the county over the time to develop plans. And eventually they were able to make it work through Arrowhead with stimulus funding. And then we have Lake County, just south of and west of Arrowhead, where the county has engaged in a plan and is working again against stiff opposition. I don't know what it is about Minnesota, but some of our incumbents are more opposed to competition than the incumbents that we've seen around the rest of the country. So Lake is really struggling against a number of anti-competitive attacks that we can go into in the Q&A if you'd like, but they were also the recipients of stimulus fund, and frankly, it's kind of exciting because neither of these 2 counties would be anywhere near the top of the list for these kinds of fast networks if they hadn't taken the initiative themselves and taken advantage of this stimulus plan that was available to all public and private entities throughout the United States. Now, I think the biggest growth we'll see moving forward is in this area here, where communities have joined together, and where communities have made more limited investments. So Alexandria, Pine City, Eagan, Chaska, Buffalo, and Moorhead have all come together to They've all independently built fiber out to different areas of their community and often are connecting local businesses. Some of them, I think, in the end ran designs to connect everyone. And in other cases, they have plans to maybe just beef up wireless services or make sure that businesses are well connected. I threw RS Fiber in there as well because a number of the towns there are working on a plan together to build a network that I'll talk about toward the end here. But the point here is that these are communities that have made limited investments, and they haven't engaged in the sort of risky investment that Monticello has or Windham has, where it's a very high risk, high payoff kind of investment. And I say high risk in the sense that this is a difficult business. And frankly, most communities don't get into it because they're excited about it. They get into it because they feel if they don't do it, their community will really suffer through having poor access. So almost all of these communities have an electric utility that has been the heart of expanding these services. And in some cases, it's really what's kept some local businesses around. And in other cases, it's one of those things where sometimes people don't even realize how good they have it, that they have this option of getting an affordable fiber connection from a utility in Minnesota that they may not have in a similar peer town. Now, I want to make Pine City, actually, I include in this list. I don't think they're actually like Detroit Lakes. Some of these places have fiber, but they haven't actually been using it to connect businesses. It's more available there in case businesses are interested, but as of yet, they haven't always seen the interest from businesses because there's often an upfront connect fee. So a common model might be that, I may pay a utility a little bit upfront to connect the fiber to my business, and then I'll save so much over a period of a year or 2 years that it'll be worth it to me. And some smaller businesses aren't as interested in those upfront connect fees. So there's different approaches for these sorts of incremental approaches. One of the things that I'll show at the end, I have a list of resources I want to end with so people can get a better sense, but these are approaches that are useful to getting a sense of, well, we know we have to do something, or maybe we know that there's a specific area that needs attention, and we want to do something that's low risk. Well, I think these are the kind of cities you want to look at as to how they've gone about doing it. And almost all of these cities also have programs in place where if they're digging up a road as part of a capital project or replacing a water main, then they're going to expand their access to the fiber, and they're going to put conduit under the streets. This is something that Dakota County has been doing as well. And a number of counties have these sorts of proactive policies. And Ramsey always sticks in my head because they've stubbornly refused to do anything. They're my classic ostrich head in the sand example, unfortunately, my own county here. But Dakota County has been one of the leaders on this. They've really crisscrossed their county with fiber. They have a lot of fiber, and right now they're in the process of trying to decide what they want to do with it. In some ways, it's an interesting example because they've really done a great job of lowering the cost of connectivity to their schools, to their county facilities, and things like that. But they haven't really developed a plan of how they want to use that to spur economic development or try and get better connections out to the residents or that sort of thing. So it will be interesting to see how they move forward, because they built their infrastructure before they really had a sense of what they were going to use it for, which is a good plan. But I'm really hoping that they take full advantage of it rather than being afraid to challenge some of the political power of the big cable and telephone companies. Now, Carver County have both learned from that, and they've been building a network, and I think they have a little bit more of a vision of how to use it. Scott, in particular, has already used it to connect several facilities, big companies, the Shutterfly company at Emerson. These are multiple hundreds of jobs that resulted from packages that Scott County was able to put together. And I know in the case of Emerson, it estimated that they'd be seeing over $1 million. I think it was over $1.5 million over 20 years because of being able to use county fiber, because the private sector is just not getting the job done when it comes to affordable connections for large data-intensive businesses, whether you're in the metro or just outside of it. La Caparle is a really interesting approach because they're a small town out in western Minnesota, and they partnered with the Farmers Mutual Co-op. which is a good co-op. Co-ops in Minnesota have done a tremendous job in many cases of building fiber networks, often with funding from the federal government. And the interesting thing that I sometimes think when I think about these projects is whether we have a rural broadband problem or whether we have a problem just with big absentee-owned companies that don't see a priority investing in Minnesota. I say that because I think La Caparo probably has better internet access than I do now in St. Paul. And I can say that's definitely true in places like Windham and Lake County and, Cook County, soon to be Lake County as well, where for the kind of capacity I have to pay a lot for, you'll be paying a moderate amount for. But La Caparo partnered, and they also took advantage of the stimulus project to help the Farmers Co-op, Farmers Mutual, to expand. So previously, farmers had already been building fiber out to their members, but they then built out to almost the entire county, with the exception of the county seat, which leads to an interesting reverse oasis problem that I'll come to. Then Anoka County is a different kind of example. They use a stimulus project as well, and they partnered with Zayo, which is a company that does a really good job of doing what they do in particular, which tends to be connecting medium and large businesses and connecting big anchor institutions and doing dark fiber. But Zayo is not really at all interested in residents or small businesses. And so Anoka, in giving so much ownership of the network to Zayo, I fear has missed an opportunity. They've certainly done a good job of reducing their costs for anchor institutions. But the result is that there's not a plan for improving connections to residents, and I'm afraid there won't be much of an effort to improve connections to small businesses. These are things that don't just happen because of the high cost of building the infrastructure. Having the backbone, like all of these counties have worked on, it lowers the cost somewhat, but it doesn't lower the cost so much that it becomes feasible for private companies to want to suddenly compete with Comcast in the residential market, for instance. So some of this stuff can be really tricky. And I don't want to oversell that it's just a matter of getting more fiber in the ground. You really have to be careful about the incentives of who owns the fiber to make sure that it will be used to continually expand and that you have an entity that's committed to fully investing in the community. Now, I just want to jump out of state for 1 second and note a model we haven't seen very much in Minnesota. We saw it briefly in 1 or 2 places, and I think we'll see it again. That's where a local government builds a network and then leases it to a private company to operate. And we see this just down in Iowa and Indianola. So it's an interesting model where the local government can focus on infrastructure, which governments typically do very well, and their partner, usually a trusted partner, this is actually very similar to the La Caparo approach, focuses on delivering the services. So I wanted to roll into a discussion about RS Fiber, which is the Sibley-Renville Fiber Project, which is really exciting as someone who really wants to see co-ops take a greater role in this. If you have an existing co-op like Farmers Mutual, they can expand, and that's a good approach. But in areas like Sibley and Renville, they couldn't find any co-ops that were already existing in the telecom space or in the electric co-op space that wanted to partner with them. And they at first went about doing a joint powers with their multiple towns and the county governments, but that proved to be too challenging and difficult to finance. So they've decided to create a cooperative. We've seen this elsewhere, but the challenge of creating a new cooperative is that no one wants to loan you money, right? You know, if all of us on this call get together and say, hey, we're a co-op, who wants to give us $30 million? It's probably, there's not going to be a long line of people that want to do that, because we're a new entity with no track record. So Sibley and Renville looked at this problem and said, well, we can use our local government authority to bond for an economic development bond and then loan that money to the co-op as seed financing. And the co-op can then take that and try to leverage it to get some loans, some federally backed loans that will allow multiple local banks pool together and invest in this project without too much risk. And so this is the kind of thing that, as it moves forward, can really be a terrific model in much of Minnesota where, frankly, there's places where the political environment is such that they don't want the local government to be building a network. And I certainly understand that. I tend to generally disagree on the merits, but I respect that, that point of view. this is an alternative approach that can unlock the power of local governments to finance an entity and have it accountable to the community via a co-op, which is something that generally people in all political stripes tend to agree with. So this is something that right now they're working on securing through the federal program, some of the matching funds and that sort of thing to figure out how to line that all up. But it's a very exciting project. The idea of connecting fiber to the farm, some 8,000 households stretching across all of Sibley County. Well, you know what? Let me just back up for a second. That was the original plan. The plan right now involves the townships themselves voting on whether or not to join it, and 17 out of 21 townships have joined it. So we have this service territory across all of Sibley County and part of Renville County, and 17 out of 21 of the townships, which are the areas outside the incorporated towns, have joined onto it. So the vast majority of them will be getting a very fast internet access connection that will be with them for a very long time. So I think it's an exciting approach, and I have to really take my hat off to them, because the kind of approaches that we see succeeding are the ones where people have gone out and spent a lot of time working in the community to build trust and to have a lot of community meetings and inform people. And you cannot do a better job of having public meetings and informing people than they did in Renville and Sibley, and it's really worth looking at. We've written about it a little bit, done a couple of interviews with them, and so I encourage people, if you're at all interested in how to, generate support or just to figure out if there is support, they're a terrific model. The other thing I really wanted to discuss in depth is how to judge the success of a network. And I think Wyndham is the perfect example. Wyndham has been accused of being a taxpayer-financed boondoggle from the cable companies for years. They said it's never going to work. It's going to be this terrible suck on taxpayer dollars, and there's no benefits. And so we've been working on a big report to try and figure out exactly what's all gone on there. And I want to start off with a story that I think everyone probably knows here, which is the Fortune Trucking story. Fortune Trucking, 47 employees, just outside of Wyndham, was going to update its IT facilities, look to the existing incumbent provider, a large national company, and asked them if they could meet their needs. And that company said, yes, we'll meet your needs. So Fortune went out and invested tens of thousands of dollars in this new equipment and went back to that provider and said, okay, we need that connection now. And the provider said, oh, yeah, I guess we made a mistake. We can't do that level of service where you are. So Fortune looked to move their offices to New Mexico, and before they did so, they asked Wyndham, which happened to be a mile and a half away, hey, before we go to the expense of moving, can you hook us up here? And sure enough, Wyndham was out there within a month with a fiber line and gave them a great connection and kept those jobs in the community. Now, Toro, a major manufacturing facility down there, went recently from a 100 meg connection to a gigabit connection, meaning that the Toro facility in Wyndham has better access to the internet than their facilities have in the metro area where I am. You have the hospital there has recently gotten a major upgrade from the city, giving them much better access to the internet and cutting their costs. The state has a 10 gigabit ring connecting the two nearby counties, Cottonwood and Jackson. And so there's a whole lot of benefits that have come out of this. None of those are really easy to monetize, to figure out what's that worth. So we tried to do that in our recent work. We did a policy brief, and we just started looking into that for that. But in the next month, we're going to be releasing a larger report that has more numbers. And we tried to figure out, is Wyndham net subsidized by the local government? And in looking at it, and Eric Lampland helped me out, really pouring through budgets and audit reports and all that, and we identified up to $1.2 million over 10 years that could have been spent of taxpayer dollars going into the network. I took those numbers to Wyndham, and they pointed out a number of areas in which we were wrong because money had been budgeted but not actually spent. So we had to revise down our estimate, and I'm saying confidently that if taxpayer dollars were used, it was under $500,000 a year. I'm sorry, it was under $500,000 over 10 years, which is less than $50,000 per year, effectively, of any sort of subsidy. And So the question is then, okay, that's $50,000 on one side. What's on the other side? And we have those benefits that I listed through: the jobs, the better connections, the better ring for the state and the county, so the county can be more efficient. Well, it resulted in this much better network connecting 8 other towns. And one of the interesting dollar implications of that is that it's no longer long distance to call between those towns now. So you've got 2,500 people taking phone service. We assume maybe if the average person may use 30 minutes of local calling now that previously would have been long distance at 10 cents a minute. So each month maybe you have 30 minutes less of this call charges. That works out to $90,000 a month. $90,000 a year in savings for the community. Just in Wyndham, you have 1,000 subscribers who get faster connections from WyndhamNet than they can from CenturyLink, which is the only other option for internet service in town. And despite getting faster service from WyndhamNet, they pay $10 less each than they would to CenturyLink for comparable plans. That savings is over $100,000 a year in the community. Now, in the larger territory, those 8 other towns, you have people who often would have been paying satellite service or CenturyLink for service, and the satellite is much more expensive. So for 2,000 subscribers, you have a savings in the community of over $200,000 per year. So we've identified, and there's a couple of other smaller things I've skipped over, but there's over $400,000 a year in savings to the community. And on top of that, you have all these jobs that have stayed in the community, an unknown number of people that have chosen to live in Wyndham and maybe commute to Sioux Falls or something. And that's all maybe at most on $50,000 of taxpayer dollars. So what I would say is that if we're going to say that, that this is subsidized and it's government involvement, well, governments involve themselves in economic development all the time. This may be one of the wisest uses of taxpayer dollars that we've seen, frankly. So those are some of the issues that I want to uncover, is that if we're going to look at local governments using their taxpayer dollars, the question isn't just are taxpayer dollars being used, it's what's the return on it. And the return there has been that the community is very strengthened in this time of technological change. The last problem that I wanted to discuss is what I'm calling the reverse oasis problem. And actually, I'm saying that someone else called that, put it in my head, and it's never going to get out because it's the best way to describe this problem. In La Caparo, they built out to everywhere in the county a fiber network, and this partnership between the county and the cooperative. And they did not build in the county seat, Madison. They didn't do that because Madison already had broadband, and I'm putting bunny quotes around the broadband there because broadband's one of those things where it can be really nice or it could be really quite slow and unreliable. In this case, they had slow cable access and slow DSL access. So now you have people living just outside of Madison, this small town, who have very great access, probably at a lower price in their homes than they have at work. When they go to work, they're less productive. Over time, we're going to see businesses, I fear, that are moving outside of Madison because we have a reverse oasis. Basically, everywhere around this town has much better internet access than in the town. And that's the result of a decision that was made at the policy because they didn't want to do something called overbuilding. This is something the cable companies always say. Don't overbuild. Overbuilding is another word for competition. But in this case, the argument is we should not have these new networks, some of which have received taxpayer dollars from the stimulus, competing with existing networks. So they chose not to overbuild in La Caparo, and we'll see what the implications are over time, but it could be very bad for Madison. The opposite has happened up in Lake County, where I mentioned that they're having all this pushback from the carriers. In this case, they decided to overbuild, which is to say that they looked at the business plan of connecting the entire county and said, in Lake County, if we try to build out to only the areas that don't have access, our business plan will not cash flow. But if we include Two Harbors and Silver Bay, these areas that have a little bit greater density and where we'll have a greater return on our investment, by building to the entire county, including the areas that have slow cable and DSL service today, then our business plan will cash flow. So they decided to do that. And Frontier and Mediacom have been very angry about that. Mediacom has gone to great lengths to try and disrupt the Lake County project. Frontier to less great lengths, but both have significantly delayed it. And I think the issue there is, and Bill, I see there's another question. I'll be wrapping up here in a second. The issue there is a question of what is fairness? When you have these older networks that were built with a government-granted monopoly, and they refuse to invest in their communities, is it more fair to build out so people have the next generation access throughout the entire community, or is it better to only provide it in select areas? In some cases, the answer may be defined by what the business model dictates. Sometimes you have to build everywhere or the business model won't work. And in other cases, it's just a political decision. But I don't think there is a fair versus unfair answer. You just have different shades of who's going to be hurt a little bit more by the policy decision. So do you want to read the question, Bill?
Your question is more of an agreement looking at the city of Bozeman and between Charter and CenturyLink. And then there's one provider, a competitor that's only in one subdivision. So that's very much you're talking about the duopoly and kind of the ability to build some places and not other places.
Right, and that's something I think the point I take away from that is that people should be aware that the idea of competition, you want to ask yourself, who's competing and where? Is this across the entire city, or is it just competition that only a few imply to? So I want to wrap up with my a couple of resources here. Any local government that is thinking about how it needs to spur its network, better networks, should look at, I would say, 3 reports right now that provide useful advice for anyone, including those who don't have municipal power companies. 2 of these recently came out and had a common author of CTC, which is a consulting firm. And they partnered for one with the New America Foundation, and it's called The Art of the Possible. And it explores some of the different policies and also has a really good explanation of different technologies and that sort of thing. It's worth exploring if you're not entirely familiar with all of this. The other is a report they did with Google that basically covers some of the items in what we call the Google checklist, which is a good proxy for what a private company or some independent partner might want you to do as a local government to make it easier for them to compete. So these are 2 papers that I think really have done a tremendous job to help us understand what local governments can do, and also recognizing that even if a local government does all of these things, you may not necessarily find a great partner that's willing to work with you. And it's unfortunate to say that. I wish that we could say that if everyone did follow these rules and follow these examples, that we'd have a great partner. But we're still in a little bit of the Wild West of this idea of competing with the big cable and telephone companies. And we're still trying to find more reliable, trustworthy partners. I do think co-ops in general, if you're in greater Minnesota, are the best place to start. And then elsewhere, also HBC, I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. And I know that they've been working with the folks in Sibley County, so I don't want to leave them out. And I did want to mention earlier as well, Red Wing is an incredibly well-connected city in a number of places in southeast Minnesota, so I want to give some respect to the folks at HBC. The third report is one that I wrote along with Eric Lampland, and this looks at Santa Monica CityNet. The only thing that's a problem with Santa Monica is people look at that and I think just assume, well, sure, you could do that in Santa Monica. What a wealthy community. Well, Santa Monica actually built it without spending any taxpayer dollars effectively. They redirected money they were already spending, much in the same way that Scott County did. And they built these incredible resources that have resulted in better connections for businesses and spurred job growth, all without really spending any taxpayer dollars or bonding or borrowing at all. So those are 3 resources that I think are worth looking at to get a sense of incremental steps a community can take and the sort of lessons you're going to want to learn, even if you're thinking about doing something more bold that would involve borrowing and that sort of thing. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we're seeing in Minnesota. It's an overview and at least one particularly promising way of dealing with it, the Sibley co-op model, and then a couple of the challenges of understanding how to evaluate whether or not these networks are successful, and a policy problem of whether you build everywhere in your territory or just the areas that do not have adequate access to the internet right now. So I hope that there's some questions. Otherwise, I'll just pick something to expand upon and nobody can leave for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Chris, this is Bill. I wondered if you had mentioned that some of our munis that have been engaged in broadband development have been electric utilities. And can you talk a little bit more about the positive linkage between the electric utility and the telecom?
Sure. There's a number of linkages. One is philosophical and very much cultural, which is the sense that we've been building infrastructure. We've been in the rights of way with our bucket trucks, and we have a billing relationship with our community. We work hand in hand with local businesses on reliability issues. They have a different relationship with the community than does a city, even a city with a water utility and that sort of thing. So there's a can-do spirit with an electric utility, and then that bleeds over into the practical with electric utilities have a tremendous need for information within their network. So to connect substations, to do smart grid metering and things like that, electric utilities already need fiber. And so if you're going to put in fiber along a given corridor, say 12 strands, well, the cost of doing 144 strands instead may only be 10%, 15% more. And then you have that and you can lease it to local companies or others. And then to some extent, once you feel comfortable dealing with that, you may say, well, we could actually hire someone that has a lot of expertise to turn this into a fiber to the home network or something like that. But it's really, it provides an impetus because often they get started with communications just to solve their own issues, but then they're a logical entity to expand and begin connecting others.
Okay, thanks. I've got my own list here of questions, so we'll see where those go. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of the city being the retailer versus running an open access network?
Sure. So I think if you talk to just about any local government that's done this outside of Tennessee, they have a different sort of culture because of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Just about any local government would prefer not to be involved in services. So conceptually, you can break our broadband infrastructure into two different things. Poles and holes is sometimes how it's referred to, the idea of, like, you know, the poles that you put you put the fiber on, or conduit that's underground that you put fiber through. And that's a very non-technical, just sort of making sure that there's space and there's an ability for providers to spread their signal around. That's one aspect of it, the infrastructure aspect. The other aspect of it is services. Being able to turn users on and bill them and upgrade them and give them ideas on how they'd want to use their services and why they'd want to pay you more money, and making sure that they don't go to a rival network and that sort of thing. Those are things that we typically believe the private sector is better at, and I would say that that's absolutely true in terms of the normal conception of a working market that has many different providers, none of whom have monopoly power. So the cities would prefer to just focus on infrastructure generally and leave the service provisioning to others. The challenge is that sometimes that model, first of all, you may not have a provider or multiple providers that are interested in working with you, because the incumbent providers are very wary of any kind of approach that could result in more competition. Now, if you've heard me speak before, I don't spend a lot of time really running Comcast down. As far as big national cable companies go, Comcast is actually particularly well run. But the fact is their business model is based on them not having much competition. And that's true of just about every big telephone and cable company that we have. They don't just view competition as an annoyance. It's fundamentally not in their DNA. So we see the kind of activities that you see in Charter. So the city builds a network with the idea that other providers will use it to offer services. They may find a challenge of having anyone that actually wants to use it. If you do find people that want to use it, there can be a challenge to make it pay for itself. So right now we build roads and we don't really expect the sales tax or the on gasoline to pay for the roads entirely. We subsidize them. but communities, when they build fiber optic networks, generally want the network to pay for itself entirely. If you're going to do that by having another entity or multiple entities being the ones that deliver service and collect the money, there's often not enough money to pay for it. So when you hear about communities that have engaged in this business and have struggled to pay their bills, the number one example is Utopia in Utah. That's often because they've used a business model that did not allow them to get enough revenue. And in some cases, this is because they started 15 years ago before we really learned those lessons. And in other cases, there's other reasons. So cities will often first evaluate this open access approach, the idea of just doing infrastructure, and then find that it's too risky and that they need to either find a single service provider that will have a monopoly over the new network, or they have to run services themselves. But I will say that there is, within open access, there's an approach that allows you to do it incrementally, where what you do is you make a modest investment that will generate enough money to pay for itself, and then you wait, and then you invest again after you've accumulated some revenue, and you build incrementally. By not taking out any money to borrow, you really can make open access work. It's just that it can take you 10, 20, 30 years to try and connect everyone. And so that kind of incremental strategy is one that's rather low risk. You still have the challenge of finding a service provider, but at least it's something that's not going to force you to raise sales taxes unexpectedly or something like that.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so if you have some maybe closing comments, then we'll turn it back over to Becky. Chris?
Sure. I wanted to note wireless. I'm generally focused on fiber because I think fiber is the ultimate long-term goal. It's something that costs a lot of money to build the first time around, but once it's there, the operating costs are reasonable, and it's a good infrastructure because it is so long-term. In a number of areas in Minnesota, if I was running the state with unlimited authority and unlimited budgets, I would probably start expanding fiber, and I would also use wireless as well as a bridge. So there's a lot of areas in Minnesota where there's poor internet access, and if you start building fiber out, it's going to take a long time to connect everyone. And so you can use wireless to get people better connections than they currently have. But I would say that we should not view that as an end game. That's a stopgap or a life raft that will help us out, but it's not something that is going to be our long-term solution. So in the end, we want to have wireless and fiber out to everyone. But for those who think that wireless is the solution, or that the current wireless technologies mean we don't have to invest more, I just think that that's incorrect. And empirically, I would point to the fact that if you wanted to use your Verizon 4G or AT&T 4G or Sprint 4G connection the same way you do a home internet connection using what most households use, you'd be spending hundreds of dollars a month on that because they have these bandwidth caps that end up racking up fees when you use them too much. So wireless is something that the term means many different technologies. But I'm afraid that a lot of times when people talk about just having wireless solve a rural issue, they're basically saying we're going to just not invest enough to really have comparable internet speeds around the country, and people in rural areas will just have to suck it up, and maybe they'll pay more and maybe it'll be less reliable, but that's too bad for them. I don't think that's acceptable in the United States. I think we electrified everyone. We can run a wire out to everyone, and it may take some time, but we can do it, and we can do it cost effectively as well, using lessons from the Rural Electrification Administration. So I don't want to be anti-wireless. I think there's a lot of roles in it, but it can't be the end goal.
Okay, good. Say Daniel Hodem has a question about technology types and GPON and wave division, multiplexing PON. Daniel, Chris is not an engineer, so we won't burden him with that hardware choices.
Well, I'm impressed, Bill, because you obviously know the technologies as well. So, I do think that, and I know of Daniel, and I have respect for him. I know he's a very intelligent person, who's been studying on this matters. I think it's important not to get caught in the technology too much. I think it's really important to look at the incentives of the owners of the networks. And even if you have one kind of technology in one city and another in another city, the differences between those two aren't going to be nearly as great as the kind of differences we see today between cities and towns that rely on absentee companies that refuse to invest versus those that have a network owned by some entity that has incentive to invest. So that's just
Good.
how I look at those sort of things.
Thanks, Chris. And one thing I'm kind of surprised you didn't talk about today, Chris, was, whenever a community talks about building a network, and whether that number is $5 million or 10 or 20, whatever the cost of that network is, that always sounds like such a big number. But I would just really encourage community members to think, well, how many households do we have, and what's their average bill by the time they add up their cable telephone or cable television and their telephone and maybe a satellite internet service or existing high-priced DSL service, and then add that up times the number of households. That's a big number too, and especially when you times that times 12 times 20 years, and there's a lot of money being spent in communities on telecommunication services, most always leaving the community. So the municipal networks is certainly a possible kind of option for communities to look at.
Yes, that's a terrific point. And, we spend a lot of money on a lot of things that leave the community, and it doesn't have to be that way, whether you're looking at a co-op or a different approach. The amount of savings that can come about. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to look at Wyndham, which is to say, if I went to the average person and if I went to 10 people and I said, how about if I raise your taxes by $2, but I give you back $10? How would that work? And some people will be suspicious and say, I just don't trust it and that sort of thing. But I think most Americans would recognize that as a good deal. And that's what happens when you work together smartly. There's things that we can do collectively that we can't do individually. And we may choose to do them collectively via a cooperative that doesn't involve government, or we may want to do it via the municipal government. But I think the point is to recognize that working together is a good solution when we're spending so much money on these sorts of things.
Okay, thanks. There's questions coming in now. Carol Monroe asked about going back to wireless. Are there any non-cellular carriers rolling out a private or public LTE network as an overlay? The technology around wireless is kind of funny, all different acronyms and so on, 4G and LTE. And up in the Lake County area, the electric cooperative there is actually rolling out some 700 megahertz wireless service that isn't probably as fast as LTE, but is in that 7 meg kind of area. The LTE network, the biggest competitor in that area is Clear, which now is going to be owned by Sprint. And they kind of are in the more metro area spaces. So that's that's kind of
right.
what. Do you have any more on that, Chris?
Well, I would say that I don't know as much about what it takes to set up the LTE networks, but there is an organization called WISPA that people should be familiar with, the Wireless Internet Service Providers, and they operate in a number of different places. They're often small companies, 1 or 2 people running it, often in rural America. And it's a good thing to check them out and get a sense of whether there's one around you or not. Increasingly, they're building fiber as well, and so they may be a good partner. But there are different wireless entrepreneurs, and it's not a space I'm as good at explaining or exploring. I'm not as comfortable talking about typically.
Compared to fiber, wireless is pretty complicated. And then John Orrell asked about if there's a resource where they can get an estimate of upfront costs before a community starts to see a return on investment. You know, I think we're seeing in the feasibility studies that Blandin Foundation has helped communities fund across Minnesota, and that Ann Tracy, a Blandin consultant, did a nice kind of comparative study on. You can find on the Blandin website, or maybe Becky can still find the link and post it here on the notes, is that the cost to build a fiber network, vary from place to place depending on the density and so on. So we've seen them from $3,500 per house up to $10,000 per home per passing. Sometimes if you have an electric utility already, they may already have a fiber ring circling your town and going right by your school and hospitals and through downtown. And so there may be already a nice base to build on. So it really takes some examination. Blandin Foundation does have a program for Minnesota rural communities called the Robust Network Feasibility Fund that can provide dollars to do those kind of studies that help you not only analyze, what your market, what is the appropriate technology, who are your prospective partners, who's going to operate this network. It's kind of a decision-making funnel that a good feasibility study will take you through. And you can find those on the Blandin Foundation site, again, at broadband.blandinfoundation.org.
I'd just like to,
Becky? Go ahead,
very
Chris.
quickly. One of the things that people often assume is that if, in John's example, for instance, 10,000 people, if they were going to build a network, that taxpayer dollars would be involved. And I wanted to note that regarding return on investment, it can almost be, I don't want to say immaterial, but what will happen in most cases is that the electric utility will go out and say, once they've spent years studying it and developed a plan, they'll sell revenue bonds to private investors who then are repaid over a period of 20 years through the revenues of the network. And so many of these networks, particularly the kind that are citywide, are funded without using any taxpayer dollars. And so the return on investment is it's nice because, once you've broken even, you can start kicking some money into the general fund or just saving it for improvements. But it's not a matter so much of taking money away from one thing to pay for another, because this is money that would not have been bonded for otherwise, and typically doesn't really impact a city's ability to engage in general obligation bonding and that sort of thing. So I just want to make sure that people are aware that just because local governments are building these networks doesn't mean taxpayer dollars are being used. Often they're not being used, and in fact, we often find that they're being saved because local governments become more efficient.
Good. Thank you, Chris. Becky, we're a little over time, which is fine because the discussion's been great. Do you want to close us out?
Yep, I see it's just a little after 4, so I want to thank both Christopher and Bill for joining us today on the webinar. Our next webinar will be Thursday, July the 10th, and there is a time change for this one, so please note it's going to be from 9 to 10 a.m., and the topic is going to be the Minnesota Office of Broadband Development, and we'll have Dana McKenzie on for that. So today I just want to thank everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.